Hello and welcome to the College Football Focus. I'm Big Italy 42. He is Spencer Limbach at Spencer_JL. As we do each week, these are your top plays and value plays at each position. So talking about the main slate on Saturday, Greg Ward Jr. I'm sure if you play college football DFS, you've heard of this guy by now. One of the better dual threat quarterbacks in the country. 9,500 on FanDuel, 86 on DraftKings. And you mentioned here, he's a pretty obvious play to you.
Yeah, especially, actually, you look at it on both sides, he's a little bit cheaper than the top guys. We're talking about like Trevon Boykin and guys like that. So him coming at about 1,000 plus discount from Boykin, I think that's a pretty easy pick on both sides. Houston's playing Cincinnati this week. It's a 72 over/under. They're favored by 8 at home, and Greg Ward has been pretty middling over the past 2 weeks, 23 fantasy points and 18 fantasy points against UCF and Vanderbilt. But those are two pretty decent defenses for the most part, and both those games actually turned into a blowout where Ward was just handing off, and they really didn't want to risk running him in anymore. Should be a different story this week with that 8-point spread, like I mentioned. Cincinnati's defense is not very good, should be competitive enough to keep him in the game. So I'm expecting that 35-plus point upside again this week that we saw earlier this season.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense there. Definitely a nice high floor. And then another guy who's a dual threat, Patrick Mahomes. You mentioned more of a tournament pick at $9,800 on FanDuel, but DraftKings at 76, though. Certainly it seems like on your end, you're thinking about him as a cash game play there because of the discount.
Yeah, and he's 1,000 less than Greg Ward over there, and it's kind of surprising on DraftKings this week. They actually lowered their cap for a lot of guys. That is to say, a lot of guys are underpriced, I should say. Like Mahomes, I believe he was like 8,600 last week. Now he's 7,600, even though he's coming off a 44 fantasy point game. So it doesn't really make much sense, but hey, I'll take the discount. So this is another high-scoring game, as Texas Tech is in every week. They're at West Virginia this week. You're a little bit hesitant to play him on the road. That's why I'm thinking of him as more of a tournament pick on FanDuel. But, it's still a high-scoring game. He still should be – all the production should flow through him, and that West Virginia defense really isn't all that great. They've gotten lit up by other pass-heavy Big 12 teams in recent weeks. So I really like him here. Threw for 480 yards last week against the Oklahoma State defense that was considered pretty good. So he's on a roll, should have plenty of production to go around this week. I think that's another solid play.
Yeah, I'm on board with that. And then next up, the other side of the Houston game, Gunnar Kiel for Cincinnati. Coming in with a little bit of a price discount, of course, from the top guys. 8,500 on FanDuel, 71 on DraftKings, and you mentioned him as a tournament swerve out the top two picks because you already mentioned that game. Should be competitive, obviously a nice high total, so he certainly has some upside there as well.
Yeah, and he's playing with a lot of confidence right now, and Vegas is expecting Cincinnati to put up some points in this one. In this last game against UCF, he went 15 for 15 with 5 touchdowns, so that type of efficiency, pretty good.
Ryan Tannehill efficiency right there.
Yeah, he's got it going with his wide receivers right now. They're going to have to throw the ball a ton to try and keep pace with Houston. So I like him as a tournament pivot. Some people are going to kind of, look at Houston's defensive ratings and shy away from him because Houston has held their opponents down so far this year, but they also really haven't played anyone. So this is going to be their first true test, and Kiel could get it going in this matchup.
Yeah, I definitely like that. And then any other quarterbacks you want to throw out there, or these are kind of your main targets?
Yeah, these are the primary targets, but I should mention Trevon Boykin because if I didn't, people may not take me seriously and may not think I know what I'm talking about. He is obviously the number one overall quarterback, but I would like Greg Ward for a little bit of a discount. I'm thinking a lot of people will probably follow that logic. So note that for tournaments, if you can fit Boykin in, at a lower ownership percentage, I think that's way you could go if you're making multiple tournament lineups. Otherwise, on DraftKings, we have Joshua Dobbs of Tennessee. They're playing South Carolina. He could get it going. Dual threat quarterback, could rack up the fantasy points in a hurry there, and he's only 8K on DraftKings. So I kind of like him as a tournament pivot from those other guys as well. Dane Evans of Tulsa in the same category. They're playing an SMU defense that's one of the worst in the nation. Dane Evans, I mean, he's pass reliant, doesn't have any rushing upside, but he could throw for 300, 350 yards and 5 touchdowns in this matchup because that's just how bad SMU is. And then we should mention Skyler Howard of West Virginia at home going up against Texas Tech. I mean, it only makes sense to kind of see him as a reasonable cash/tournament option in this high-scoring matchup. And Texas Tech's defense, I mean, that's probably one of the best matchups to date for Skyler Howard. So he could get it going in the deep passing game this week.
Yeah, definitely like that. Speaking of running backs over here, your top option, if you're paying up, like you mentioned here, Christian McCaffrey, as he should be, averaging about 1 million yards per game, looking like the Devontae Freeman of college football, and kind of in that same line you mentioned last week, had 133 total yards, but not a touchdown. So he's, I mean, almost the exact same, similar, because he was putting up a ton of all-purpose yards, scoring a bunch of touchdowns, and kind of had a down week, but facing a really bad defense this week.
Yeah, and that was a really strange game last week at Washington State, so I'm not going to read too much into that. It should be back to business as usual for McCaffrey and Stanford against Colorado, and their defense just hasn't really held any running back in check. If you remember, Royce Freeman of Oregon ran wild all over them a few weeks ago. So I'm expecting McCaffrey to do the same. He should put up 200-plus total yards in this game and get into the end zone at least 1 to 2 times. So the $8,900 price tag on FanDuel, that's not too expensive. I mean, it might be a little bit difficult to work him in. You're going to have to sacrifice maybe a value play here and there, but I think he'll be worth it this week.
Yeah, and another guy you mentioned here as an obvious value play. There's been a couple of those, and if you've been on Twitter here in any of the college football talk, you obviously know Wendell Smallwood from West Virginia, 6,700 FanDuel, 64 on DraftKings. He's been the model of consistency here, as you mentioned. This is going to be a really high-scoring game, and it's not often that you get a guy in this high-scoring of a game that's as heavily involved as him at this cheap price.
Yeah, he's going to be very popularly owned this week, but I think it's a necessary one for cash games and tournaments alike. He's been great in some worse matchups, so 100-plus yards in 4 of the past 5 games. The only one he didn't eclipse 100 yards was against Baylor when he only got 12 carries, as West Virginia was in a deficit right from the beginning there. But facing Texas Tech, one of the worst run defenses in the country, West Virginia's favored by 8. They should be running the clock, trying to put Tech away. It's a home game for West Virginia. That helps too. So, I mean, everything just falls into his favor, and to have him at a mid-range salary is just the icing on the cake. I mean, I think you should have him probably in all your FanDuel lineups.
Yeah, that's a bold statement, but it makes sense there. Next up, Demarcus Richard from Arizona State, 7,100 on FanDuel, 68 on DraftKings. And you mentioned 25-plus fantasy points in 3 of the last 5 games. And Washington State, kind of going back to what you just said, how it was a strange game last week. This is still a team that, I mean, I don't know if they've ever had a good defense, but it's not a good defense.
Yeah, I'm expecting them to go back to the team that we thought they were. This time around, it should be a high-scoring matchup against Arizona State. Granted, it's a little bit tough traveling from Arizona to upstate Washington. That's a little bit of a trip. Could be. I mean, I'm worried about Arizona State falling out flat, but even if that's the case, if they come out starting slow, I think they can pick up the pace, as we saw last week against Oregon. The offense was just firing on all cylinders, and Richard was a big part of it. So he's a heavily involved passing game, rushing game. Should be a high-scoring matchup, and I think he's right around a mid-range, upper mid-range salary. If you can't quite get McCaffrey, I think you can settle for Richard and feel pretty good about it.
Okay, and before we get to the obvious play at wide receiver here, you got any other cheap guys or pivots or anything like that as far as running backs go?
Yeah, going through them real quick, DraftKings only play Jalen Hurd of Tennessee. They're favored by 3 touchdowns, or 3 scores, I should say. In this one, I think it's a 16, 17-point spread. That South Carolina defense has been one of the worst in the SEC this year, so 5.5K on DraftKings, I like that. Drake Johnson is a value play to look for. Keep an eye on here. He's from Michigan. He's minimum salary. FanDuel only is this Michigan-Rutgers game, but Rutgers has a bad run defense. Michigan should be winning this game. Maybe they'll give Drake Johnson a few more carries. He was the only running back to really do anything last week, averaging 5.5 yards per carry. And Devion Smith, their usual lead back, is banged up. So maybe Drake Johnson can get a few more carries, get into the end zone. That's a reasonable tournament play for minimum salary.
All right, I like that. And then now talking about the obvious wide receiver play, it's Josh Dachshund from TCU. We've seen this guy have just ridiculously high upside. Already mentioned Trayvon Boykin being the top quarterback on the slate. But 30-plus fantasy points in all but one game, and that was the first game where they kind of struggled against Minnesota. But other than that, I mean, you mentioned unstoppable, and that might even be kind because it's been, the ball's going to him, and no one has stood a chance yet.
Yeah, and this is going to be another high-scoring game against Oklahoma State. I think some people might shy away from Dachshund, and I kind of hope they do, leaving him with a lower ownership percentage, just because their opponent, Oklahoma State, has good defensive ratings. But those came against some pretty bad opponents. We saw what they did last week against a legitimate, spread offense, good passing attack in Texas Tech. They got gouged for 480 yards through the air, so... Mahomes and Jakeem Grant had it going against them, getting big plays all over the place. So I think Dachshund can do something similar and really keep his streak of 10 catches, 150-plus yards, 2 touchdowns. He's had that in the last 5 games. I think he'll keep it going this week.
Yeah, definitely nice floor upside combo. Gabe Marks from Washington State mentioned how bad their defense is, but this is one of the more prolific passing attacks in the whole country. 7,800 on FanDuel, 66 on DraftKings, and like you mentioned, it's not a bad spot to be the number one target on, the Chargers passing attack of the college football.
Yeah, and Gabe Marks, I target this guy pretty much every week just because he is the number one receiver for probably one of the best passing attacks in college football. And Arizona State, their opponent this week, ranks 102nd overall against the pass. We saw it last week against Oregon. I mean, they had guys wide open down the field, just running. Granted, they didn't catch it all the time. I'm still a little bit bitter about that because I had the Oregon wide receiver that dropped a 80-yard touchdown. So, but regardless, Arizona State defense not very good. Should be a shootout. Washington State's at home. There was a little bit of a struggle last week against Stanford. That's what you'd probably expect, as Stanford's a good defense. But Mark still put up a respectable stat line. I think he had 7 catches, 80 yards, and a touchdown. So he's definitely capable of multiple touchdowns and 100-plus yards.
Yeah, another guy here, similar upside, but not nearly as expensive. 6,700 on FanDuel, 5,500 on DraftKings. Sheldon Gibson from West Virginia, and you mentioned here this is a guy who's a deep threat. So looking at game logs may not tell the entire story about his potential in this matchup.
Yeah, if you look at the game logs, you'll see he has 2-3 receptions in each of the past 3 games, and you might be a little worried that he's not seeing the targets. That's not really the case. This West Virginia passing attack, if you've ever watched them play, they just love to chuck the ball downfield. I mean, they don't really care about pass completion percentage, which is kind of a rare thing this day and age when everyone's doing the short passes just to sustain drives. But Gibson is one of their deep threats. They have a couple wide receivers that do that. And last week against TCU, he had a couple, could have been touchdowns. I mean, they were knocked away at the last second. And my train of thought here is that facing a much worse pass defense in Texas Tech, he could get behind that coverage and he could make some of those deep passes happen. So if that's the case, 100-plus yards, 2 touchdowns, could be a very good reality for him.
Yeah, I like that. And then that's the last of the listed guys here. I'm sure you've got some other values, GVP play type of guys to throw out for wide receiver.
Yeah, I got White of Arizona State going back to that shootout there. He's been one of their more consistent wide receivers on the edge, so I like him for a mid-range salary, 6.3K on FanDuel, 5K only on DraftKings. And then you have River Craycraft, speaking from the same game. He's kind of the number 2, number 3 option along with Don Williams there, but Craycraft is a little bit cheaper. He's only 5.7K on FanDuel. And as I said before, the Arizona pass defense has just been pretty bad over the past several weeks. And then going back to West Virginia, Durant is minimum salary. He's another guy who they like to go deep with. He also had a couple, questionable maybe touchdowns against TCU last week, but couldn't quite bring it in. So facing a worse pass defense, maybe he connects on one of those and pays off that minimum salary.
Yeah, I like that. And then tight end, as we know, not a lot of options as usual. Austin Hooper, though, from Stanford, $3,700. Another one of those Stanford guys was involved in that. You mentioned kind of an anomaly of a game, but this is a guy that has big upside, and there's not very many tight ends that have even marginal upside.
Yeah, and he's caught a touchdown in 4 of the past 5 games. Usually gets about 5 to 7 targets per game, and they really like throwing to him in the red zone. So you add that all up, and it's no wonder why he's the most expensive tight end. But he'll probably be worth it in this matchup against Colorado. So if you have the cap space, I think he's the guy to go with.
All right, and then a cheap play, C.J. Conrad from Kentucky, $2,300, facing off against Georgia. Obviously, this is a team that's, like you mentioned, going to have to score points if they're going to have a chance to even keep this one close. And, against a good defense, probably going to be more short passes than long passes. So it makes a lot of sense to target the tight end there.
Yeah, this is your punt and pray special of the week, as he's probably one of the more legitimate minimum salary tight ends. But, I mean, there's not really much to beat him in that barrel cellar, I should say, down there. 10 receptions in the past 3 weeks. Granted, he went for 1 catch and 7 yards last week. That's kind of the give and take that you have with these minimum salary tight ends. But I'm expecting him to be involved in this passing game, and maybe Kentucky has to throw a little more than usual, so he could see a few more targets.
Yeah, I like that. Any other guys you want to throw in there as like your hope he catches a touchdown type of tight end play here?
Not really. I think Conrad's really the only one there. I mean, kind of in between the two, you have Cody Cole of Arizona State. I think he's 3,400, kind of as a pivot off of Hooper. High-scoring game and, a passing attack that likes to throw the ball. Cole could get a touchdown or 2. He's had nice upside in the past, so that's your tournament special there.
All right, I like that. That's going to wrap things up for us for this week. Find us on Twitter at DF Cafe. Subscribe to our YouTube channel. We got lots of other great content for NBA, NFL, everything else at dailyfantasycafe.com.